The stock market is a device for transferring money from the impatient to the patient. I've repeated that line throughout my life because it captures something most people only understand after they've paid a high price. When I talk about the market, many people imagine charts, numbers, things going up and down. But what's really happening there has very little to do with numbers. It has to do with people, with emotions, with impatience, and with a quiet fear that never really goes away. The fear of being left out. Over the course of my experience, I learned early that most losses don't come from complicated mistakes. They come from very simple reactions to things that feel urgent. Not thoughtful decisions, reactions. Someone sees movement, hears a story, senses excitement in the air, and feels that pressure inside that says, if I don't act now, I'll miss it. There's a feeling that shows up again and again, no matter the decade, the technology, or the situation. The feeling that everyone else seems to know something you don't. That there's information circulating, an opportunity unfolding right now, and that hesitation means permanent loss. Today we've given that feeling a name, but it existed long before that. I saw it when people talked about stocks, then real estate, then companies that were supposed to be once in a lifetime, and later anything that became the center of attention. Throughout my life, I noticed that people rarely make bad decisions because they want to. They make them because they feel pushed by time, by comparison, by the idea that standing still is worse than being wrong. And that's where one of the most expensive behaviors I've ever seen lives. Acting just to avoid being left out, even when you don't truly understand what you're getting into. I learned early that human beings have a curious talent. We're very logical when we analyze other people's mistakes. But we become remarkably creative when we need to justify our own impulses. I've done this myself. I've seen something rising, heard convincing stories, felt that sudden urgency, and watched my mind work overtime to explain why this decision made perfect sense. It wasn't greed, I told myself. It was opportunity. It wasn't impatience. It was insight. At least that's how it felt in the moment. The problem is that decisions driven by this feeling rarely come from clarity. They come from comparison, from the sense that someone else is moving forward while you're standing still. Over the years, I've learned that few forces are as powerful as that. Not because they're accurate, but because they're emotional. And emotions are very poor advisors when you're dealing with the long term. Most people think the real risk is losing money. In my experience, the greater risk is losing control of your own behavior. When decisions are driven by fear of missing out, conviction disappears, and decisions without conviction don't handle discomfort well. They need to work quickly. If they don't, regret arrives almost immediately. I've seen this cycle repeat countless times. People rush into something because everyone seems to be talking about it. They feel smart for a short while, sometimes days, sometimes weeks, and then, when the excitement fades, what remains is a quiet, uncomfortable question. Why did I do this? The answer is rarely technical. It's emotional. It's urgency. It's comparison. It's the feeling that there was some hidden information others had and they didn't. Over time, I learned to distrust that feeling deeply. Whenever something looked attractive, mainly because everyone was getting in, I asked myself who exactly that everyone was, and more importantly, why it had to happen right now. Time is a very honest filter. What's truly solid usually still makes sense after the noise dies down. What depends mostly on collective excitement tends to disappear with it. There's also something quietly ironic in all of this. People say they're thinking long-term, yet they react as if every short-term move were decisive. They say they trust time, but they watch every fluctuation as if an answer were expected immediately. Over decades, I've seen this contradiction far more often than most people realize. And it's costly. The fear of being left out creates artificial urgency. It turns decisions that could be thought through calmly into fast reactions to external noise. And when you react too quickly, you give up your greatest advantage, the ability to wait. Waiting isn't passivity. Waiting is an active choice. But it's uncomfortable because it means accepting that something might be happening without you. I've learned by observing that many people would rather be wrong with the crowd than right alone. Being wrong together hurts the ego less. It offers a sense of belonging, but the financial outcome is usually the same. The market doesn't care whether you were accompanied. It responds to decisions, not explanations. Here's something that always stood out to me. Most people believe they're reacting to information. In reality, they're reacting to the emotion that information triggers. And emotion is not information. Emotion is noise. Once you learn to separate the two, many opportunities start to look different. Some still make sense. Many lose their appeal entirely. Over the years, I've realized that impulse works very much like something simple from everyday life. Impulse is like scratching a mosquito bite. It feels good immediately, but it almost always makes things worse later. The moment you act, there's relief. The tension drops. Doing something feels comforting. But soon, the itch comes back stronger, and the damage has already been done. In this first part, I wanted to focus less on money itself and more on behavior. Because, in my experience, fear of missing out isn't really a financial problem. It's a human one. It shows up in different eras, under different names, but always with the same result. Rushed decisions justified by urgency. In the next part, I want to go deeper into how this sense of withheld information is built, why it feels so convincing in the moment, and how most people unknowingly reinforce the very behavior that harms them over time. Over the years, I've learned that the fear of missing out doesn't arrive suddenly. It's built slowly, layer by layer, until it feels natural. Conversations start it. Headlines amplify it. Stories of success, usually simplified, polished, and incomplete, give it shape. And before long, what began as curiosity turns into pressure, not pressure from facts, but pressure from atmosphere. I've watched this pattern repeat across decades. First, a story appears. Someone made money. Someone got it exactly right. The story sounds clean, almost too clean. There's very little mention of timing, context, or the mistakes that came before the outcome. Those parts don't travel well. What travels is the ending. And endings, when separated from the process, are powerful triggers for emotion. As those stories circulate, the tone shifts. At first, people ask questions. Then they start making statements. And eventually, they ask questions that aren't really questions at all. Did you see this? Are you in yet? There's still time. Notice how rarely the question is, does this make sense for you? The real question is almost always, why aren't you in? As if being out is a delay, not a decision. I learned early that human beings have a complicated relationship with the idea of standing still. Standing still feels unproductive. It feels like falling behind. There's an assumption, often unspoken, that movement is always better than patience. But over the course of my life, many of the best decisions I made looked, from the outside, exactly like doing nothing, waiting, watching, letting time expose what enthusiasm tends to hide. The sense that information is being withheld grows stronger when someone believes there's a group that knows something they don't. That belief creates discomfort, and discomfort demands relief. Not because a decision is good, but because the feeling is unpleasant. The mind doesn't want understanding in that moment. It wants relief. And relief, more often than not, looks like action. What I've found interesting is that when you ask people later why they made a certain decision, they rarely say, because I thought it through carefully. They say, because everyone was talking about it, or it seemed obvious at the time, or I didn't want to miss out. These explanations are understandable. They're human, but they're weak foundations for decisions that need to hold up over years. Another thing I've noticed is that the fear of missing out doesn't disappear once someone gets in. It simply changes shape. There's relief at first, then a new anxiety appears. Fear of getting out too early, fear of staying in too long, fear of losing more, fear of gaining less than they could have. The anxiety doesn't go away, it moves. Because the problem was never the opportunity. It was the way the decision was made. There's a quiet kind of humor in this if you look at it with some distance. People say they want security, yet they chase whatever is loudest. They say they think long-term, yet they react to each new development as if it were decisive. It's a bit like saying you want peace, but sleeping with your phone volume turned all the way up. It's not a lack of intention. It's a human contradiction. I've seen many people confuse confidence with certainty. True confidence can live comfortably with doubt. Absolute certainty usually comes with urgency. When someone says, "There's no way this can go wrong," that's often the most dangerous moment, not because it must go wrong, but because the person has stopped considering alternatives. And when you stop considering alternatives, you become fragile. Over time, I learned to value simple questions. Questions that don't sound impressive, but quietly protect you from impulsive behavior. Questions like, will this still make sense when nobody is talking about it anymore? If this goes wrong, will I understand why? Or will I just feel tricked? Am I acting because I understand, or because I'm afraid of being left behind? Most people don't ask these questions at the moment of decision, not because they're incapable, but because the environment doesn't reward reflection. It rewards speed. Fast news, strong opinions, short stories. Everything pushes in one direction. Act now. And the more people act, the harder it becomes to stay still. I've also noticed that fear of missing out feeds on incomplete comparisons. People see results, but not paths. Outcomes, but not the accumulated errors that came before them. This creates a distorted picture of reality. It looks like everyone is succeeding, when in fact many are simply sharing the most convenient part of their story. There's something freeing about accepting that you won't participate in everything, that you don't need to be part of every conversation, every opportunity, every movement. Over time, I realized that consciously stepping aside is a way of gaining clarity. When you choose not to enter, you're saying that your decisions aren't dictated solely by noise, and that strengthens your relationship with yourself. The fear of missing out also weakens when you begin to respect time. Time exposes exaggeration. It separates what was temporary excitement from what was genuinely durable. But for time to help you, you have to allow it to pass without interfering at every moment. That requires tolerance for uncertainty, something many people avoid, not because it's impossible, but because it's uncomfortable. Across decades, I've seen intelligent people lose money not because they made one mistake, but because they repeated the same pattern whenever urgency appeared. And I've seen ordinary people build solid outcomes simply because they learned to recognize that pattern and pause instead of obeying it. In the final part, I want to bring this conversation down to the everyday level. How to live with this feeling without trying to eliminate it. How to weaken it. How to create small mental habits that turn urgency into observation, comparison into reflection, and impulse into waiting. Nothing dramatic, just adjustments that can survive real life. Over the course of my life, I've come to understand that dealing with the fear of missing out doesn't require heroic discipline or secret knowledge. It requires something much simpler and at the same time much harder. Accepting that urgency is temporary while the consequences of decisions tend to last. Once you truly accept that, you start treating haste with more caution and silence with more respect. I learned early that urgency has a talent for disguising itself as clarity. It arrives with confident statements, well-told stories, and the quiet suggestion that time is running out. But in reality, time almost never runs out suddenly. What usually runs out is patience. And when patience disappears, decision-making suffers. One of the most meaningful shifts I've seen, both in myself and in others, is changing the question at the center of a decision. Instead of asking, "What if I miss this?" asking, "What if I get in without understanding it?" That small change moves the focus away from fear and toward comprehension, and decisions grounded in understanding tend to hold up far better when discomfort appears. I've also learned that there's nothing wrong with staying out of something you don't understand. The real problem is getting in simply to calm anxiety. Anxiety demands immediate action. Clarity asks for time. Learning to tell those two voices apart makes decisions quieter, slower, and usually better, even when everything around you feels loud. Over the decades, I've noticed that people who manage this feeling well tend to create small mental rituals. Nothing elaborate, just pauses, waiting an extra day, sleeping on a decision, sitting with discomfort instead of trying to erase it. These pauses don't eliminate fear, but they weaken it. And once fear is weaker, it stops being in charge. There's a gentle kind of humor in all of this, if you're willing to see it. Almost everyone already knows what they should do. The problem isn't lack of information. It's an excess of hope placed in fast decisions. Hope that this time urgency is justified. Hope that speed will finally be rewarded. It rarely is. With time, I realize that most people don't need more opportunities. They need fewer impulsive choices. They don't need to be involved in everything. They need to be comfortable staying out of what they don't understand. That comfort doesn't attract attention or create exciting stories, but it builds something far more valuable: consistency between what you believe and how you act. I also learned that making mistakes is unavoidable. The goal was never to avoid mistakes entirely. The goal is to avoid repeating the same mistake for the same reason. Once you recognize the pattern, comparison, haste, fear of falling behind, you've already made progress. Recognized patterns can be interrupted, even if not perfectly, at least more often. The long term favors people who don't sabotage themselves, and self-sabotage rarely looks obvious in the moment. It looks like opportunity, it looks like urgency, it looks like privileged information. Only later, when the noise fades, does the true nature of the decision become clear. That's why learning to wait isn't passivity, it's protection. I like to use simple images because they stay with you when emotions rise. Impulse is like scratching a mosquito bite. It feels good right away, but it almost always makes things worse afterward. Immediate relief is deceptive. Waiting, uncomfortable as it is, usually preserves. And when it comes to money, preservation almost always beats impressing. Over the years, I've come to value decisions that appear boring to those on the outside. They don't generate excitement. They don't invite constant explanation. They don't demand attention. But they quietly accumulate something powerful: peace of mind. And peace of mind is an underestimated asset. It helps you think clearly, rest better, and make steadier decisions when it matters most. If there's one thing I hope you take from this conversation, it's this: you don't have to chase everything. Opportunities will still exist tomorrow. What matters is arriving at them with clarity instead of urgency. Time doesn't punish those who wait. It punishes those who react. If you'd like to keep learning with me, subscribe and keep following along.